Welcome to Sectors Up Close. I'm Elena Casas. Today we're focusing on the US car industry, and my guest is Bob Jenkins, Global Head of LIPA Research at LSEG. 2022 was the worst year on record for US car sales as pandemic supply chain problems meant factories ran out of parts. In 2023, auto workers walked out on strike for months and successfully negotiated better pay, meaning car makers' costs will now be higher, even if the supply problems are resolved. All this has slowed down the switch to electric, where growth in sales is losing momentum. The S&P 500 Automobiles Index, though, gained 30% in 2023 as investors put their trust back into the car industry. Is that justified, though? Well, let's ask Bob Jenkins of LSEG. Bob, hi. Thanks for joining us. Now, Americans are driving less, aren't they, than they were before the pandemic? So should the industry assume that sales will ever go back to what used to be normal?
Americans like their cars, right? So to your point, we did have a good 2023 and it was off the back of a miserable 2022, and production was very, very low in 2022. But we're in at about 2 million or so short, if you will, in terms of sales and production from 2023 compared to pre-pandemic. So we're kind of getting back up there. But again, as I mentioned, Americans love their cars, and about 8% of those sales were EVs, in fact. And to the point, we did have the strike over the course of 2023, but that really didn't impact things. There was a lot of good pipelines of parts and such. We had the dealer lots were pretty full, and that pent-up demand just seemed to work its magic despite the high interest rates. Can they keep that going forward? And one of the things that is a legacy of the strike, of course, is higher wages. And so that's going to make it more difficult for dealers and automakers to lower prices. And I think we're going to see that as being a problem going forward.
You mentioned that car makers thought they'd solved their supply chain problems in 2023. With the recent disruption in the Red Sea, are these problems coming back?
You know, they might. I think a lot of experts who look at the shipping industry aren't as worried. The biggest problem, of course, in the pandemic, I should say, we had just boats sitting outside of ports. They weren't being loaded or unloaded. We don't really see that. Yes, we're having some shipping channel problems, but for the most part, right now, it's requiring that cruise around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds about 30 to 40 days. That does add cost, and the container per container rate is in at about doubling right now, but it was up 5 to 10 times during the pandemic. So we're not seeing, again, quite the dramatic impact on the costs of shipping. There's more capacity coming online and such. And what you have to do is start to account for the extra time. And once that kind of gets accounted for, likely the impacts won't be that dramatic.
Let's talk then about the switch to EVs, Bob. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, provides subsidies only if all the parts of a car are made in the US. Is that giving the US manufacturing industry the boost that was hoped for?
To a degree. I mean, as usual, there's always a way around, right? So the IRA, as you mentioned, is given about $7,500 in subsidies. Now they're actually doing it at the point of sale. So they're making it less of a end of the year thing with your taxes. They're making it at the point of sale. And if you lease, for instance, you can kind of work around it. And in general, yes, subsidies they're very important. And we're seeing that really across all the major car buying and selling regions around the globe right now. Subsidies are really what are holding up the EV industry.
Are the US companies struggling then to compete with China, which of course is also getting huge amounts of government help in terms of accelerating EV production?
Very much. I mean, what China's done, of course, is that they're producing extremely cheap cars, and that kind of does have a reverberating effect across all. Right now, the U.S. isn't particularly interested in importing a lot of Chinese EVs. They're going to slap a lot of tariffs on it and such. But generally, that kind of low price point is something that everyone is paying attention to, and the pricing in general is one of the major kind of headwinds that EV adoption is facing, that along with the charging infrastructures and the range anxiety. So I think when you think about what is it that's really kind of getting underneath the slowdown in the US EV adoption, it really comes down to a combination of pricing and infrastructure of the charging stations.
Tesla essentially started a price war, didn't it, Bob, by slicing its own prices. If other car makers are forced to follow suit, what does it mean for them? Is it possible that this could give the EV switch the boost it needs in terms of sales?
Yeah, exactly. So here in the US, in the EU, and of course in China, it's all about subsidies. And subsidies are never something that lasts forever. And once those subsidies subside, prices simply have to come down. So here in the US, for instance, the typical electric vehicle is about $8,000 to $10,000 more than an ICE vehicle, a combustion engine. And same is true across Europe and China. Of course, it's heavily subsidized, so we don't even know how the comparison works. But when we see those subsidies cease, as we did, for instance, recently in Germany, sales drop dramatically right away. And so again, consumers reacted to that. So that means that there is going to be that pressure for automakers to sell these vehicles at a lower price. And that part right there is going to prove problematic because right now they're more expensive to produce.
Given the mixed picture, Bob, from an investor perspective, should you be buying car companies?
I would be a little worried of all the things we just mentioned in terms of the fact that, again, we've seen subsidies go away in Europe and sales drop just immediately for the first time since 2020. We know that, again, in the U.S., we now have actually more of a floor built underneath pricing due to the higher wages now that the auto workers have achieved. So all those things kind of combined mean I don't know how they're going to be able to maintain that. And we still have, by the way, a high interest rate environment. And we have consumers kind of winnowing down their savings at this point in time. So they're going to have to take on car loans. So all those factors, I think, make it to be a lot of headwinds for auto manufacturers.
Bob Jenkins of LSEG, thank you so much for that analysis. Well, that's our look at the US car industry. You can watch more videos on Reuters.com.